first of all, welcome everyone. I just love knowing that you're out there and somehow we're all linked together as always. We have a new person with us, Mary. There are likely to be other friends who have been and guests who've been invited. We are always attracting people who are attracted to books and literature. And so we're just thrilled. So Mary is a friend of Alexa's. No. Mary is a friend of Judith's. Correct, right, Judith White. And so we're really thrilled to have you. There'll be others and perhaps we can acknowledge them at the end. For the time being, because our format is very different from what we would normally be doing, I want to go ahead and jump right in. I've welcomed you. I want you to know it's so good to see and hear your voices, even though it's only hello. I love watching you wave. I love your pictures. I love Debbie for putting up that lovely photograph. Anyway, our first discussion for this season, The Nickel Boys by Pulitzer Prize winning novelist Colson Whitehead. Today's discussion will be led by our distinguished panel of Literary Society members, Alexa Donovan, who is the moderator, joined by co-moderators Jack Smith and Roberta Todd. We will additionally have a fourth person, and that is Gail Edwards. She is our tech member, and she's a member of the panel because she's going to oversee all of the chat room and on some level, all of our participation. With that, Alexa.
All right. Thanks, everyone. It's so good to see all of you. And those of you whom we can't see, we know you're looking fabulous, even though we can't see you. And so thank you for coming, for joining us. This is an amazing book, and it's a lot of content to cover. Even though it's a small book, it's really power-packed. Just to give you a general overview for those of you who read it back in May and maybe haven't had a chance to reread it, but just to tell you a bit about this, it's set in the 1960s, and it follows Elwood Curtis, who was a studious African-American from Tallahassee with a strong sense of justice, who is adjudicated delinquent, mistakenly, after riding in a stolen vehicle. And he's sentenced to, or sent to, the Nickel Academy, quote unquote, a juvenile reformatory in Eleanor, Florida. And there he befriends Jack Turner, who goes by his family name, just Turner, who has a less optimistic view of life in general. And once Elwood tries to serve his time there without any incident, being high-minded, feeling that he will be able to do that, but he's beaten seriously on 2 occasions, once after coming to the aid of a boy who's being victimized by sexual predators, and then another time after writing a letter that's complaining about the poor conditions at this reformatory. This time at the school is interspersed with accounts of the older Elwood, now in New York City, and flashbacks. And after, when Turner overhears a plan to have Elwood killed, they decide to attempt an escape. And this is kind of taking this down into, distilling it down into a real capsule. But when they attempt this escape, Elwood is ultimately killed and Turner escapes. And then, in fact, later on, we find out that Turner has adopted Elwood's identity and tries to live up to the ideals that he established when they were together. And he learns about that in New York City. And then when there's an investigation opened in 2010s, it finally begins to unravel what was actually happening at Nickel. And then he realizes that he's going to have to return and give testimony about what actually happens to his friend. So we would have loved to have been able to have Colson Whitehead. Some of us have heard him read and had discussions, but I thought about showing you this short video of an interview with him because it tells us, it sets the stage for what he wrote and talks a bit about the actual reform school that this is based on, and it gives you some background. And in fact, for me, one of the things that was most startling about the video was to actually see the White House, which was very different from what I ever imagined. So with that, Roberta is going to show you this brief video from CBS Sunday Morning.
Right. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute everybody, and then I'll unmute myself, and that's so that you can hear the video. Let me unmute myself. I'm not muted. Okay, let me share.
Magazine has long been a sign you're a person worth taking note of. That's exactly what happened to author Colson Whitehead, who the magazine recently called America's storyteller. Here's our Lee Cowan with the fine print.
When we caught up with acclaimed author Colson Whitehead, we found him buried beneath a mountain of his own making. His new novel, The Nickel Boys, is so highly anticipated that his publisher corralled him in a warehouse outside Baltimore for 3 days to have him sign some 15,000 copies, all in advance of the book's release later this week.
I really loved the Underground Railroad.
Really enjoyed Underground Railroad.
If you think that's a lot, you need only to look to his last novel, the surreal slavery epic, The Underground Railroad. He's still got writer's cramp from that one. It made him the talk of the literary world. Former President Barack Obama became a fan. And so did Oprah.
The Underground Railroad.
How does one find out you're on the Oprah book list? Does she call you? Do you get an email?
She usually calls. Really? I was sort of traveling that day. My plane landed, and I saw there's a voice message from my agent. I was like, what do I do now? I'm in trouble. And she just said, Oprah. I was like, huh? I didn't want to, curse. I was on an airplane. And I was like, shut the front door. And that started a lovely journey into Oprah's world.
That kind of attention not only landed him on the bestseller list, but earned Whitehead the National Book Award and the coveted Pulitzer Prize in Fiction in 2017.
After winning the Pulitzer, expectations are probably pretty high. How do you deal with that?
Other people's expectations are exactly that, other people's expectations. I try not to worry about them too much.
He's as self-deprecating an author as you'll find, despite having 8 well-received books to his name. His characters range from zombies to elevator inspectors. Experimental writing, he calls it. A style born, he says, not of the classics, but something else.
Did you always want to be a writer?
From when I was like 7 or 8, I'm reading Marvel comics, thinking it'd be cool to write Spider-Man. That'd be a cool job. It's sort of overcast outside today, and this is my perfect day growing up. I could just watch Twilight Zone reruns on UHF, read comics, science fiction, and no one's going to say, can you go outside like a real boy and do sports or go swimming?
The Underground Railroad and his newest, The Nickel Boys, stand apart, though, for their focus on race. Not so much as a history lesson, he says, but a reminder that in his almost 50 years, things have changed very little.
My parents taught me that, 1, I can do whatever I want in the world if I put my mind to it, and 2, the white world will be trying to destroy, dismantle your hopes, and possibly kill you at the same time.
The governor of Florida and his cabinet have given the go-ahead for researchers to begin a grim project.
It was grisly news of a once segregated reform school outside Tallahassee that gave Whitehead the setting for The Nickel Boys. Dozens of bodies had been discovered on the campus in unmarked graves, many of them black boys, and the pull to write about them was hard to resist.
How can this sort of atrocity continue? How many people have to turn a blind eye? And the thousands of kids who go through it, what are their stories?
The Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys, as it was called, was supposed to be a grand experiment in reform when it opened in 1900, but it soon became a house of horrors, repeatedly investigated for allegations of child neglect, abuse, and sexual assault. Although it closed in 2011, it still haunts the grounds. Rusty cots and dented desks linger, and so do the memories of its now graying survivors.
It was supposed to be a reform school, but what was it?
A slave camp for kids.
A slave camp?
Yeah.
Pastor Johnny Lee Gaddy, now 73, was sent to Dozier for skipping school in 1957. It wasn't long before he got his first beating with a leather strap called Black Beauty.
The strap about 4 foot long, it had holes in it. And when they hit you with that belt, it will suck the skin from your body.
The beatings, he says, always happened in this small building, known only as the White House.
He hit me that first lick. I jumped up, turned the bed loose. He slapped me upside the head with the belt. He said, "You don't get back down, I'll kill you right now."
And you're 11 years old.
11.
One day, when Gaddy was hauling garbage to be burned in an outdoor pit, he saw something he will never forget.
I threw the stuff out there in the pit, and I saw a boy's hands in the pit.
A boy's hands?
A boy's hand in the pit. And I told the boy, I said, "Man, that's body part right there." He said, "Johnny, please don't say nothing about that. Say you can be in there too."
In the end, forensic teams from the University of South Florida found more than 50 sets of remains. And this past spring, another 27 suspected graves were discovered.
And who are those boys? Thought we had the story 3 years ago, and now a whole other chapter opens up.
Whitehead never met Pastor Gaddy, but read his account and others online. And the stories so disturbed him, it was more than he could stomach to visit what's left of Dozier himself.
Part of me refused to go. The only thing I could really see myself doing at the place is torching it or taking a bulldozer to it.
For all the trauma he's written about, he has found happiness in his personal life. While his home is in Manhattan, his escape is the Long Island town of Sag Harbor, where he shares a home with his wife, a literary agent, and his 2 children. He can't stop writing. In fact, he's already about a third of the way through his next book, a crime novel set in Harlem in the 1960s.
I'm very excited to read this.
Colson Whitehead. Prolific, perhaps, but passionate, without a question.
If you could describe yourself as a writer, how would you describe yourself?
I'm going to borrow an assessment from a friend of mine, and she said that I was the most productive, laziest person she knew. And for me, that was the greatest compliment, because I do like hanging around the house and staring off into space. And I also love having something in my life that I'm compelled to do that does give me pleasure.
Exploration. It's in our DNA. And there are new worlds to explore.
Thanks, Roberta. I think it's wonderful to be able to visualize some of what it is that is the backdrop for this novel. And having discussions with my co-moderators, with Jack and with Roberta, we talked about a few things. And one of the ideas that we had, just to take the pulse of the group, was that we put together a quick poll. There's 3 polling questions that you'll get to respond to very quickly, and simple yes or no, so that we can get a simple idea of things. And the first one is whether or not you enjoyed reading this novel. For some people, it was a hard read, and some people had difficulties completing it. Another question we had was, did you see the twist coming? And finally, is this a redemption story? So please take a moment right now and cast your vote.
Cast.
So of we have 10 people out of 35 have voted, 42%.
I think we've got 37 participants.
Yeah, but one participant, but only 35 can choose because the 2 co-hosts can't vote and the person on the phone can't vote. So we have 22 results. Is everyone able to find the poll? You can unmute yourself now. We're not showing the video. If you need to say something.
Yeah. I don't know. This is Sarah. I don't know where to find the poll.
Okay, so for some reason,
I'm pretty new on this.
Okay, so it could be that your pop-up doesn't come up on your screen.
Oh, it doesn't.
So that could be the reason why. Sometimes if you block pop-ups, you can't see the poll.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know we won't get everybody.
Okay.
But we have 24. I just don't want to end the polling if there's some people voting.
Roberta, if someone's having technical issues, can they chat their answers to you?
Yes, Gail will see it. So
Great.
read the questions again, Alexa.
The first question is, did you enjoy reading this novel? The second one is, did you see the twist coming? And the third one, is this a redemption story?
And the all yes or no answers. Gail, you getting?
Okay, we're gonna wrap so that we can keep things moving.
Yeah, I will end the polling now, and then we will display it, okay? I'm sharing results.
So interesting split, about 2/3 of folk enjoyed reading it and a third didn't. And
interesting.
There are surprisingly some people who saw the twist coming, and it's a little bit ahead of people thinking that it is more or less a redemption story, and some believing that it is not. Relative to the twist itself, there was a big clue in the prologue that I know I missed, and some others may have missed also. That right in the prologue, Whitehead says that in New York City there lived a nickel boy who went by the name of Elwood Curtis. And that's on page 5 if you have the hardcover. Who went by the name of Elwood Curtis. And many people, myself included, certainly missed that. Interestingly, another clue that many folks miss, myself included, is on this cover, by the way. This cover is an award-winning cover. The book itself has won several awards in addition to the Pulitzer, but the book cover has also won awards. But if you look closely at the book cover, you'll see that the two figures have one shadow. And also, interestingly, you'll see that one of the figures is exiting the red frame. And so without ever reading the book or studying this cover, that's something that, these are clues that we were given that were right in front of our eyes. We did not, some of us. I see that 10% or 11% of the people did see that twist coming. I certainly wasn't one of them. So we had a discussion amongst ourselves and kind of came up with some themes for this discussion today. The overarching protagonist in all of this is systemic racism, as I think most of us would agree. But we decided to come up with 3 themes that we wanted to discuss today, 3 sort of overarching general themes. One of them, which Jack will address, is the prison industrial complex. The second is optimism versus pessimism, or idealism versus realism, which Roberta is going to tackle. And the third was the treatment of women in this novel, which I'm going to address. We had each crafted some questions, and in the interest of time, we're going to try to stay within some 15-minute time frame brackets. You will be able to raise your hand in the chat in order to answer questions. Please raise your hand, and Gail's going to help us to acknowledge the questions as we go along. This is a different format for all of us. Some of us have done different kinds of Zoom, and Zoom can have its own inherent challenges, but we're going to do our best to make this an active discussion. So with that, Jack, unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I wanted to take a second and to give heartfelt thanks to everybody in the Literary Society, and also especially to my lovely and wonderful co-host and moderators, Alexa and Gail and esteemed Roberta, and our leader-in-chief, Lana. Wanted to start off with a second to give a meditation moment for the members and friends and families that we may have lost in the COVID situation, including one of the musicians who was in the Duke Ellington Society, Ray Carmen. I also just wanted to give blessings that we're all together and going through this. I wanted to take the discussion and just attach this theme of the prison industrial complex to the idea of the Central Park Five. And I wanted to bridge between the Nickel brothers, Nickel boys, in the novel in Tallahassee, Florida of 1964, and the Central Park Five, the Exonerated Five in 1989. And I wanted to start with just a brief, and then I wanted to read a poem and then just open it up to any of the particular parallels that may exist between the circumstances in the Nickel boys and the prison industrial complex, the new Jim Crow, but especially the Central Park Five, the Exonerated Five, and some of the current murders that have sparked Black Lives Matter and the activist movements. I wanted to start off with on the paperback version of the novel. There's a discussion between the Elwood / Turner and his second wife, his spouse Millie, and I just wanted to read a brief excerpt from it as a prelude to the poem, and then open it up to discussion of what parallels may exist between 65 and 89. Turner begins saying, "I used to live there," Turner said, his tone. "Elwood, like testing the ice to see if it bear her weight." This is Millie. "I was at Nickel. That's the place I told you I was in juvie, but I never said the name. Elwood, come here," Millie said. He sat on the couch. He hadn't served his time as he told her years ago, but he ran. Then he told her the rest, including the story of his friend. "His name was Elwood," Turner said. "In some ways, Turner had been telling the Elwood story ever since his friend died. As he stopped being this desperate alley cat of his youth and turned into a man he thought Elwood would have been proud of. It was not enough to survive, you have to live. Now, Millie on page 206 says, who was he? He was him, the man he always had been. They treat us like subhumans in our own country, always have, maybe always will. His name didn't matter. The lie was big, but she understood it. Given how the world had crumpled him up, the more she took in his story. To come out of that place and make something of himself, to become a man capable of loving her the way he did, to become the man she loved, his deception was nothing compared to what he had done with his life. Now, this is just a second on the Central Park Five, and then I just want to ask what parallels may exist. The story of the Central Park Five spans decades. There's also a link in the chat room to the Central Park Five or the Exonerated Five. In 1989, Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, and Raymond Santana and Corey Weiss were coerced into confessing, and Yusef Salaam was tried and convicted in the brutal rape of Tricia Melly, a young investment banker found beaten and near death in New York City's Central Park. Railroaded by detectives and prosecutors who overlooked glaring inconsistencies in their swiftly retracted confessions, the boys were convicted and they served between 6 and 13 years in jail. But after the real perpetrator confessed, their convictions were vacated in 2002. 12 years later, 2014, the city settled a civil rights lawsuit brought by the men for $41 million. But the story continues today. In the wake of Netflix When They See Us, a 4-part miniseries produced by Ava DuVernay based on the case, former Five prosecutor turned novelist Linda Fairstein was dropped by her publisher. She resigned from the board of Vassar College. And in the years since their exoneration, the men have become outspoken advocates for criminal justice reform. I'm just going to give a second on each one of them. Antron McCrae. In 1989, Antron McCrae was a shy 15-year-old living with his parents, Linda and Bobby, when he was coerced into falsely confessing to be involved in the rape. He was released from prison in September of 1996, and he moved to Maryland. These days, McCrae is a married 45-year-old father of 6 living in Atlanta, but he still bears the scars of his ordeal. I'm damaged, you know. I know I need help, but I feel like I'm too old to get help now. But it eats me up every day, eats me alive. My wife is trying to get me help, but I keep refusing. That's where I am right now. I don't know what to do. Kevin Richardson, the youngest of the 5. Kevin Richardson was a baby-faced 14-year-old when he was arrested, and he went on to serve 5 years in a maximum security youth prison. Then he was transferred to Coaxie. Today, Richardson says, PTSD is real. I go through that. People might think on the outside looking in that I'm doing well because we got the settlement. That doesn't erase the time that I did. We always say we have invisible scars that nobody sees, and no matter how you cover it, the scabs will come off. This is the last one I wanted to address. He's a poet, Yusef Salaam. He calls himself Dr. Salaam. Salaam served his sentence not that far from 145th Street in Harlem, at the Harlem Village Youth Facility until he was 21, and then he's transferred to the maximum prison, Clinton. While in prison, he focused on his Muslim faith. He completed a bachelor's degree. He was released in 1997. Though he and his then wife went on to have 3 children, the marriage fell apart. Yusef believes that he might not have ended up divorced so soon if he hadn't rushed in, said the author Burns, trying to make the most of his time. Salaam has since remarried and is now a father of 10 children residing in Georgia. He's a public speaker, and he wrote, and in 2016, then President Barack Obama honored Salaam with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Now I'm just gonna finish on these last 2. Raymond Santana went in, he was in 1995. He was convicted, he confessed, he was later released, and he was convicted 18 months after he was released of parole curfew, and he served a further 20 months. He was then free for 6 months before he was caught in possession of crack cocaine. He pled guilty to intent to sell the drug and received a sentence of 3.5 years to 7 years. He said that he was the person who reached out to Ava DuVernay with a tweet. And he said, I never met Ava. I never met the woman. I didn't even know who she was, but I watched Selma, the video. There's a part where Dr. King is confronted by his wife, Coretta, with recordings of him with another woman. And I felt like that was bold to put in the film. By showing that, it showed me the human side of this man and who was put on a pedestal. And it told me that she had no fear of telling the truth. The two others are Corey Weiss, and then the last one, Corey Weiss is actually the last one. He was suffering so profound that the producer of the series dedicated the majority of the series to him. At 16, he was the oldest of the 5 boys. And under the law at the time, he spent the most amount of time in a violent adult jail and prison. He served nearly twice as long as the other boys did, almost 14 years in total. While he completed a GED, he didn't receive the resources to address his learning and his hearing capability and his learning disability. Once freed, he found work in construction and for a time was employed by Reverend Sharpton. When the city finally settled with the men, Weiss, who earned more than $12 million from the settlement, he still lives in New York. He works as criminal justice reform, and in 2015, he gave a donation of $190,000 to Colorado's Innocent Project. It was renamed the Corey Weiss Innocent Project. And then I just want to read this poem from Yusef Salaam and start and ask for your thoughts on whether there are parallels. This is Yusef Salaam and E.B. Zobi's book called it Punching the Air. The story that I thought was my life didn't start on the day I was born. The story that I think will be my life starts today. This is the poem. It's called Movie Star. The people who know me, really know me, are not the ones the judge and jury want to hear from. It's as if they wanted to hear a story about some other kid. It's as if they wanted to watch a movie about some other kid. The prosecutor, with his fancy words and his hard evidence, wrote the script, directed the scene, cast just the actor to play this kid from the hood who beat up a white kid really bad, so bad that he can't wake up to tell the truth. So I wanted to just open up the discussion for our brief amount of time and ask whether there are parallels between Nickel Boys in Tallahassee, Florida, 1964-65, in Central Park, the Exonerated Five in 1989. Your thoughts, please. I need your rich feedback and conversation.
If you want to respond, please raise your hand so I can keep track.
Alexa, I do not know. This is Liv. I do not know how to raise my hand on Zoom.
It's okay, Liv. We've got you.
We see you.
Ask your question.
It's fine. We can see you, Liv.
Yeah, please ask.
Oh, good. So what the Jack, what they have in common for me is the reality that Black children are not entitled to innocence at all. And I don't mean here penal. I don't mean criminal. I mean that we Black people can be babies until a certain age. Don't know if that age is 3 or 4, but by the time we are 7 years old, I'm thinking of Tamir Rice here now, the little kid who was playing with a water pistol in the playground. By the time we are old enough to play, we are seen as criminals. So what happened for me when in my case, I listened to Nickel Boys. So when our protagonist got into that automobile he was hitching a ride, he was still speaking as an innocent. And I think that part of life where your innocence is presumed is not part of the Black experience. They take that. They, meaning systemic racism, doesn't include innocence for Black children.
Thank you. Debbie? I heard you were raising your hand.
Yes, I was raising my hand.
Okay.
I don't know so much that I think of it as a parallel as much as I think of it as a continuation. And I feel like the way that Black youth consciousness are shaped by the prison industrial complex is very specific. And to your point about exactly when the moment happened where he steps into the car, it just seemed like an organic transition where it's just like, at first you're like, well, why is all this stuff happening? But then it's like, of course that's what's happening, because for us, it's a dragnet that's put out, you know, and for us, it's not so much that those things are an exception, but just an organic thing that happens in the Black community where everything is set out to arrest us. To a very large degree, it feels like right now that's what, that's how this country's set up, right? That we are supposed to go through those things, that of course you're gonna have your time in the jail system. You know, it's like everything was just laid out too well. He was going directly to college and then all of a sudden, whoop, you know, it's the most vivid memory I have of the Central Park Five was when Yusef Salaam went to go testify, the court drawings of the trial. And what stood out for me was the fact that he made the decision to take the oath on his Quran instead of the Bible. And I remember being around that same age at that time. And I remember having the conversation with my mother and telling her they didn't do it, you know, and just knowing, I mean, he looked the most like me, and I understood to a very large degree how much he was not just going to be believed just because of what he looked like. And it just hurt that whole time because of such close proximity in age, they felt more like my siblings. And it's just like, of course, it's just the natural progression of things, unfortunately. And that's what it is that we sort of kind of have to deal with. That's my response to your question.
Thank you. I thought that was fantastic. I think that's fantastic. I'm wondering, is there a, it's like Fanon, is there an impact on the people who are abusers, but then there are the people that are abused? And is there an impact on those of us who are abused so that Turner's transformation into Elwood, is there a situation in which the people that have been abused have to choose to come out of the living dead and to rise up, not Pollyannish, but like he said, I went from an alley cat into a human being. I'm wondering, do we see parallels between what the five are going through and what happened with Turner confessing to his wife, number two, that this is who he really is and this is why he is? I'm just wondering, is post-traumatic stress disorder and the implications and impact a part of what may have been a continuation of these issues, whether it was Tallahassee in '65 or today in 2020?
And we have a response for you. Gail Wright would like to respond.
No, I was responding to the earlier comment, so I'm going to pass on this one. And I agreed with the first two panelists, both of those comments about the historical connection between losing innocence as a child. If we look at slavery and little girls who were required to be nannies almost, and little boys who were required to be slaves and do work. So it's a continuum, it's not a stopping. If we look at the prison industry and prisons and police started in this country, not to police and protect whites just generally, but to control Black slaves. So it's a continuum. There's been no stop in this pattern. And I think that everybody has talked about that already. And that's really what I was going to comment on. This next very erudite comment of Brother Jack, I shall leave to someone else.
I'm open. It's a buffet of wonderful conversation. I'm open to all and all, any and all. Please respond or share whatever thoughts. Thank you so much, Gail, and share whatever thoughts might be of interest. It's your buffet. Let's eat.
Jack, remember we also wanted to touch on the commercialism of this. The industrial complex is an industrial complex and exists because there's money being made and a lot of it. Mm-hmm. And so there is no incentive to take down these institutions. And even with nickel, the boys were making bricks. Their labor was being used. They were being farmed out. They did painting, they built gazebos, they did different things. And similarly with the Central Park Five and what they were paid for their labor or not paid. I mean, there are other parallels that are economic. There are certainly physical and abuse parallels, but the industrial complex in and of itself is a money-making machine.
Alexa, I just want to share with you what I heard on the news today. In El Paso, because of the COVID death.
Now when you ask for the news, I'll play a channel from your top source. You can still hear your flash briefing at any time. Just ask.
Hey, someone mute. Sorry. Okay. I was trying to say in El Paso, Texas, they are paying prisoners $2 an hour to remove bodies because they can't get anybody at $27 an hour. And this is because and they're moving bodies from one frozen spot to the other. And this is because of COVID-19. And this is now. I'm hoping you heard me.
Thank you, Roberta. Sorry, Jack, did you have something else that you wanted to add specific to this element of it?
I think that it's a very, very, very enlightening point that it's a continuum, as the other members have brilliantly pointed out. It's not that was then and this is now. It's a business. We can use the prison industrial complex, the new Jim Crow, the systemic racism. We can use whatever description we want, but the bottom line is we know that it has robbed our children and our young people of any age or presumption of innocence. There is none. And it is also in my thinking that within the Central Park Five, people didn't necessarily make money, or financial assets weren't the primary objective from lynching them. The primary objective, in my opinion, one of the biggest things that was done is they rode to power. They ran for office. They were elected. Let's get up front. Some of them became the chief executive officer of our esteemed United States. They rode the social capital that lynching these children provided, and they'll do it because it was very profitable. Now, when it was exposed, they had to reverse it. The prosecutor who led the charge had to step out of being on the board of Ivy institutions. Her publisher dropped her, but that was after she had wrecked their lives, and that was after she had and there are others who rode it to power and never were held accountable for it. They wear it as a badge, as these other lynchings were done in other years. It was always a badge. It was a cultural and social badge of honor to hang us from a tree. So I totally agree that it is a prison industrial complex. It's a system. And I totally agree with the brilliance of the author in showing then and the continuation to now, as well as the discussion of where the responsibility or the transformation of an Elwood, almost like a Dr. King, into a Turner, not very different from a Malcolm X in his background, to a humble and vulnerable human being that recognizes his redemption is in confessing to his spouse of his battles. And I found that was reflected in the pain that these young people who went through the Central Park were still going, despite the money. They got money, but how much money can help one of these young people when their life is a continuation of clear PTSD, of trauma, and essentially being tortured. And I just feel like that there's a lot of brilliance in what this novel is showing us about ourselves and about our current circumstances.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to get Katie. Katie had something to say. Katie Madison.
Hi. I don't remember which chapter it is. I think it's like, maybe it's 12 or 13, but there's this, the boys go to the ice cream shop, and then kind of Elwood talks about like, I want to take the ice cream cone, but like the friend that he's with, the like complications around the memory of what ice cream actually stands for to him. And I think that it's kind of this cool metaphor that like encapsulates all power. I think is a really big theme in this story. I think that if we look at from the beginning of time, like pre-colonization, pre-imperialism, like everything's always about power. And I think that unfortunately, if you're a person of color, if you're Black or brown or indigenous person in this country, you're constantly learning, like, no one's gonna offer you an ice cream cone, like, because they actually want you to have an ice cream cone. You're always having to like don't take candy from strangers, like what's the actual get? And I think unfortunately, because we were all brought here, designed to like try and exist in a system that like was never made for us on like stolen land, we have built up our own really problematic coping mechanisms to just try and survive. And then when we're young, it's like, Debbie and I talk about this a lot, like when you are in your womb, and I'm not a mother, so please, and I'm probably the youngest person in this room, so take everything that I'm saying like with all the grains of salt. But when you are in your mother's womb, for a second, you are literally like grown in all that she has, right? So what does it say to be grown in an environment, in the womb, in the body, in land that was like in a system that was never designed for you? You inherit all that stuff, and your body is like getting all of that stress, and then you're constantly learning how to like take it off. And very few of us actually understand or get to experience the nirvana of removing all of this ick that is constantly on us. So we can't just sit and enjoy an ice cream cone, and we can't just enjoy our youth because we're like, there's shit that's got to get done, right? Like everybody's got to work. And having a really comprehensive understanding of your own emotional intellectualism is profound. And when we were never supposed to like read or write, now they want us to also like get in contact with like how we're feeling, and then be so aware of how we're feeling that we make time for that over like getting food on the table. And it's a lot to ask. And this is all while we're also just trying to like survive because we might be murdered for walking out the door, right? So all of these things are constantly wearing on us and our physical body. And I think that it would be so nice to just be able to have an ice cream cone and enjoy it, and not worry about why you're actually being given something sweet. Yeah.
Thank you. That's actually going to tie in to what Roberta will be discussing it relative to optimism and pessimism, or realism and idealism. We're
Alexa, may
Yes.
I say one more thing before we
Sure.
move on? Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to add to what Jack was saying. He had maybe a few different distinctions. And the one I want to add, I'm sorry, there is in my background a voice going, and the voice is a device that uses your name, so please forgive. But I wanted to say here that I wanted to add to Jack's the notion of how we imprint each other, and systemic racism likes that we are able to tell each other stuff to cope. I'll never forget riding a bus and having a group of young Black male teenagers sitting in the last seat on the bus, and I overheard the leader say to others the expression, "When you get to central booking," as if getting to central booking is a foregone conclusion. So I want to call that imprinting. And Katie, I want to have us look at how we interact with each other in such a way that it imprints that miasma we all live in, that ickiness we all live in. We imprint each other with that in very casual conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Liv, very much. I'm going to now pass it on to Roberta. We're trying to respect everybody's time and stay within the frame.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at another short clip. So I will mute everybody, and it's just a minute, okay?
School, but you're telling it through a very personal lens. There are two characters in the book who we're following the story through, and both of them are at the school, but both of them see the school through very different lenses. One sees the school as like oh, this is not going well, but you know, it's not the world, or it's not America as it's supposed to be. And another goes, no, this is exactly what America is all about. Why did you choose to tell the story in that way?
I could have said it in 85 and in 1924. I picked 1963 because it's the height of the civil rights movement.
Right.
And Elwood, our positive character, optimistic character, has seen advances in terms of social order and justice. But it's also the height of segregation, Jim Crow laws that restricted Black life and movement in America. And so we had these two warring ideas of progressivism and entrenched injustice. And so Elwood thinks he can change the world. He's been inspired by Martin Luther King and the marches he's seen in his lifetime. And then there's Turner, who's an orphan, and he's always lived by his wits and doesn't think that people change or systems change.
Right.
I think, you know, I think they represent parts of me. I have an optimistic side and a pessimistic side, and are often at war with each other. And I think it's a fundamental sort of philosophical disagreement we all have.
I wanted to, I felt that he actually expressed perfectly the difference between the idealism and realism that I think, as he said, all of us work with. And the question that I have that I'd like to start with is in chapter 1, Colson says, optimism made Elwood as malleable as the chief taffy below the register. So I want you to think about that, and what role does Elwood's high-minded ideals play in his undoing, and what message do you think Whitehead is sharing with us? And I want you to contrast that with, in chapter 10, he talks about Turner, and Turner says, and I want you to consider the Ginger Man story. Ginger Man story, and he calls out, you can't, he says, Ginger Man called, and remember the folk heroes rally crying, you can't catch me, you can't catch me. A good way to be. He didn't remember how the story ended. Now that's how Whitehead told us to us. And Whitehead repeats the Ginger Man story 2 times, in chapter 10 and chapter 16 when they escape. So I want you to think about, to share just initially that component. And we're going to spend a little time with that, and then there are a couple of other questions. Any takers? I think Thyra has her hand up. Thyra, can you unmute? No. Well, I will at least share with you my thought with the, I felt that Whitehead was leading us right away about the impact of being maybe a little too high-minded or being a little too optimistic. And I felt that he was really, in this book, kind of showing us the downfall of doing that. So that's why I shared that. And I felt that Whitehead tricked us with the gingerbread story, because the gingerbread man basically couldn't escape, but yet in Whitehead's story, he does. Turner does escape. So I thought that that was another twist that Whitehead gave to us by repeating that story. Then I went to look at the Chicago Defender. Whitehead references the Chicago Defender, and we also get to see how important it is in the community. And he has Elwood, who is written to the to the Chicago Defender 3 times. One time he gets his article published, and that was an article that he wrote about what should older people do to help regarding the civil rights movement. Then Whitehead comments about this, and he says, when he's written, because Elwood, if you remember, he talks about how his father, as he remembered the story on his father, who he hardly knew, but that his father had complained about how he was treated in the army and was rewarded for it. So Elwood writes 2 stories to the Chicago Defender. And it says, but he hadn't heard back, even when he mentioned in the editorial he'd written under another name. It had been 2 weeks. More distressing than the notion that the newspaper didn't care about what was going on at Nickel was that they received so many letters like it, so many appeals, they couldn't address them all. The country was big and its appetite for prejudice and depredation limitless. How could they keep up with the host of injustices, big and small? So my question is, do you think that that those are adequate excuses for why the Chicago Defender, if they did receive articles like this, or even all other Black people that received articles like this, that they didn't respond?
Deborah James wants to respond to either this question or the question before.
Respond. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, the question before.
Yeah.
So it really was wonderful the way the author used the speeches of Martha King, the letter from the Birmingham jail, to sort of that Elwood gave a voice to. And I thought, instead of sort of his undoing, in fact, it was that very motivation that resulted in Turner coming forward and deciding, look, I want to live my life based on what I've learned, you know, the way Elwood lived his life. So I thought that was sort of a victory, actually. I mean, a difficult one, but a victory. And I think similarly to sort of those who would say, you know, you had King Dreamer, who ends up dying very violently, a peaceful man, but what did he leave? I think it sort of, I think, shows the power of what King was talking about and what he espoused, the idea of, you know, loving, you know, your enemy, and love will eventually conquer. So I thought Turner ended up sort of exemplifying that in a way.
That goes to another point that I was going to make. So I'm going to share with you that in chapter 14 and 16, he quotes the one thing that he kept saying: throw us in jail and we will still love you. So it's going back, and this is Elwood quoting King while he's spending his time there. And the question I ask is, do you think that Elwood maintained the agape love throughout his life, his short life, because his life was shortened, based on what he got from Martin Luther King? Because he quoted King about 16 times through this book. And,
yeah,
and it's
Roberta,
with King. Yes?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good. So when I was reading about Elwood, I was totally thinking about the student at Hampton who packed up for me all of the stuff I needed for my vending at the Black Fine Art Show. And what the magazine's editor shared with me was an interaction she had with the Hampton student. She said to the Hampton student, who was from Augusta, Georgia, she said to him, so do you like James Brown? Because he was from Augusta too. And the student said, I don't listen to music. My mom doesn't let me. I'm so sorry about the phone. Doesn't, oh, good Lord. That's it on the ringing. Thank you. I don't listen to James Brown's music. My mom plays the radio for me. My mom sings Christian music. So when I was reading about Elwood, I was also thinking about the upbringing of this young man currently at Hampton, whose single mother also created an ambience in the home that was relevant, delivered role models, but did not include the real world. So I remained in that space of what can happen when you, one, as a Black mom, seeks to protect, again, the innocence of your son by keeping at bay all that icky stuff that's out there. He will have King's speeches, or he will have gospel music, or he will have biblical text, but none of that other stuff. So we Black moms jump through hoops to keep that world away from our sons. So when I was hearing about Elwood's optimism, all I could say was, yeah, it worked, and also was his undoing.
Thank you. Roberta,
Me.
Sorry.
Gail. Can you hear me, Gail? This is Gail.
Yes, Gail. I'm sorry. I was telling Roberta that somebody else had raised their hand, but you go ahead and speak, and I'll let her speak after you.
Well, it's a Gail after a Gail and a right after a right, so there's
It
a double
is.
thing going on here. I can only echo what was said about the value or the impact of religion on all of us, whether it's a mother protecting her child with a sense of religion, or we ourselves being able to say, I'm going to pray about it. I'm going to have God understand it. It'll be all right by and by. So there's a historical place for our soothing, you know, and we get it in our church. You know, when we look back historically at the founding of the church, the relationship of the church to Black people historically going through this thing called America, going through this thing called the world, quite frankly, it's significant. And I think that the other significant ways that we deal with this would be music, would be art, you know, how we dance, how, you know, people say, well, you all sing, you dance through it all. You know, people are beating you and you still go back and you sing. There's a way to deal with this inhumane pressure and trauma that we all suffer, that we all carry on. And I think that the book in many ways, it doesn't deal with all of the mechanisms and the strategies that we use as humans, as Black humans, to deal with the injustices that are imposed on us, but it does deal with some of them. And I think that religion has been one tremendous source of strength for us, whether it's in relationship to our sons or our daughters or ourselves and our souls. So I would echo all of that.
Thank you, Gail. Debbie, and then Althea.
So there's the religion, right? And there's also the religiosity, right? When Elwood, it's like he started to develop this self-righteousness about him, right? You walk and you think you know these things and like whatever. And then he got his butt whooped when he turned almost snitch, right? And I say almost snitch because he was going back and forth. He was hanging out with these folks doing like whatever. And then he had a decision to make. And then look at what he did and when he chose to make that decision. And so that's sort of what happens. And so the lesson the street always teaches you is like, you could do all that if you want to, you know, and so it's sort of like the religiosity as opposed to the religious aspect of it. And so the whole notion of what it means to be religious, you know, founded in the whole notion of religion in its narrowest definition, simply being disciplined. So he was disciplined enough to walk a particular kind of straight and narrow path, but I believe what we talked about before, the whole notion of a high-mindedness, if you're walking in that high-mindedness without being careful of what the street is just sort of telling you about how to survive, then of course you're going to get hit in the head or land face first real hard. And there's a space that you kind of have to navigate. And we don't have the same kind of luxury of being able to make particular kinds of mistakes because there are other things in place, because there's a prison industrial complex, because there's a mental health complex, all those other things happening at the same time. So it's just like, well, when it was so profound that that moment of epiphany doesn't happen with just one human being. It's literally, it has to be two folks for us to get the pure understanding of what that has to be, right? There's this religiosity of a Martin Luther King, but there's also this religiosity of a Malcolm X, who's very clear about what the streets tells you, what you can and can't do. And I think that's what it is that we're learning, that it is we have to sort of navigate.
Thank you. Afia? You have to unmute.
I got it. Yeah, I wanted to speak to Roberta's question of why didn't the Chicago Defender do something? And the thing that popped into my head was a phrase, and I don't even remember where it comes from. Resistance is futile. You know, where the system is going to do what it does, no matter what you think about it, no matter how much you fight it. And we see that over and over again. It's like I'm looking at all the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and things that have been going on, and the police still continued to shoot folks, to kill folks, even while we were protesting. It's like, do they not hear us? And so I think that perhaps why the newspaper may not have done anything is because they, first off, you get retaliation. If the Chicago Defender or even the community says too much, there is going to be swift retaliation. And that's what we're looking at now with what's going on in the whole, in my opinion, what went on with the election and how we were not sure which way it was going to go. Even though we're sitting here looking at fascism in the face, we're still not sure which way is this thing going to go. Even though we all know that what's going on is wrong, it's incorrect. People, it's what went on with Hitler. Folks still sat there and watched it, not believing it was going to really happen. And to me, that's what we're looking at now. And that's what we as a people, since we got here, since we were brought here, have been looking at. Can this really be happening to us? Can human beings really do this kind of thing to each other? And we still hope against hope that this is not true, but then we have the evidence. And again, it's where I think it's something with the robots where where they say resistance is futile. You can't win. And then we look at the Bible and religion that tells us, well, you can win if you believe. You know, and I have to laugh because I'm a minister, but you know, I'm also a follower of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. So yeah, I believe the white man is the devil, you know, and I don't even want to say excuse me because yeah, I do believe it. And that he got a whole lot of followers, unfortunately, in the Black community too. So, you know, it's what do we do with this, you know, and to quote, I believe it's Langston Hughes, one of his poems, here we stand on the edge of Harlem and wonder what will we do in the face of what we remember. I always think of that poem because it's what do you do with this? Can you really trust them? They keep saying, trust me, I'm on your side. And then they stick the knife in your back and now they're sticking it in our chest. So, you know, right to our face. So what do you do?
Thank you.
You realize you're climbing up the rough side of the mountain and you continue to climb because ours is not a quick fix. There's nothing talismanic about this moment of protest. We've been protesting. We've had many different kinds of approaches to change, whether it's Du Bois or Garvey. And I think that we have to think about that and be consistent with it. You know, one of the things that Garvey said was that the change is not going to come from the intellectuals and the thinkers and those of us who live in ivy towers, but it's going to come from the people from the bottom up. So I think it's a constant. You know, as an old civil rights person, my thing is, you know, you win a case, you lose a case, and you keep on filing them. You keep on going at it, and you have and you relate to and are capable of accepting different mechanisms. I thought the book was interesting because it quoted Martin Luther King, and it did not quote, as far as I can remember, Malcolm X. I found that. Did anybody else find that to be true? That was one of my big questions. Maybe I missed those quotes.
He didn't quote.
Because you know who I'd be quoting.
Thank you. Just want to say in this order for 1 second. Katie, Deborah, James, and Makita.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll try and keep it succinct this time. I think that I'm gonna look at Liv brought this up, and then Gail, right? You also touched on it, and I think that I'm sure everybody knows that like who we listen to shapes how we hear, what we hear, and when we hear it. And I think that one thing that I've learned is that like in this system, everybody's trying to figure out how to do it, right? And so like, as I was reading the book, I even asked, I'd be like, well, why King, right? Like, why not Marcus Garvey? Why not Malcolm X, right? And then I also think, okay, well, it's a gendered issue, right? Like, it can be a gendered issue. And kind of like, I also think that whether you're listening to like Tupac or Biggie or Jay, or Du Bois or Langston, right? Or you can take your pick about who to listen to. And I do think that early on, we are given what our parents teach us. I recently pulled out an old Eric Carle book, and I grew up on it. It's like, what is it? Draw Me a Star. And I was like, oh man, I loved this book as a child. And then I pulled it out as an adult, and Debbie's like, it's actually, there's all the symbolism in it. And it's kind of like how you can find your way back to your relationship with the sky. Anyway, we are, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or, you know, everybody's trying to survive in this way. And unfortunately, another thing that Colson Whitehead is also showing is there's also like a market for our pain, right? There's also a market for Black people writing about our pain because people love to consume it. And it's like, yes, write the thing that really talks about how hard it is for you all to be Black because we love it and we will pay for it. And then you're like, well, I'm making money, so it's great, but I'm also shining light to it. But then there are also all these artists who just write about the stars and the moon, and that really feels good. And so some of our earliest, this is one of the things that Gail was touching on, it like there are other ways to figure out, to take your lessons from. And however we find our own ways to take our lessons from, one of the like unfortunate parts of it is that here there's always an ulterior motive. Same thing with like the Bible and religion versus religiosity. Like what's the ulterior motive for like people saying what they want to, and like why are we more inclined to hear it from somebody who like the majority of people deem as like literate in a certain way, and why are we never hearing about the Black women who actually held the first meetings of the NAACP that like nobody even knows their names? It's a really complicated issue, and I'm sure plays into the other issue, the conversation about maybe about gender.
Thank you, Katie. Deborah James?
Unmute.
Well, yeah, so Elwood, to me, I thought the recording that of the interview where Whitehead talks about this tension that he feels and that we're all feeling in terms of the idealism of an Elwood and the realism or the realism of Turner. I don't know, I think it's, the two are sort of inextricably bound almost. So, but for Elwood's sort of determination to expose the corruption that was going on and his idealism that he thought perhaps the newspaper should pick it up, or this John F. K-esque looking investigator would take the ball and run. I mean, but for that, his sort of having planned and made this, you know, kept this sort of journal of the corruption that was going on, but for that, and but for his determination to have that done, and then you have Turner sort of struggling over, well, should I have done that? And then in the moment, should I do that? You know, it will be for naught. I mean, but for that, you wouldn't have had Turner, frankly, escape. You know, the story would have taken a different turn. And I'm thinking, well, what does that tell us? That you know, there's a struggle, and there are those who have the courage to. I don't find Elwood so high-minded. I just felt he had the courage. He had the gift in terms of one of the few who had been educated in the, you know, this rotten system that was designed not to educate Black boys, and then to use that, his abilities to sort of, you know, join that struggle and to try to, you know, move the struggle forward. So I think the two things are inextricable, and I don't really find, well, this was his undoing, and in fact, I think it was his destiny, perhaps, but I wouldn't call it his undoing.
Thank you, Debbie. Makita?
Oh, I just wanted to respond to the question about the Chicago Defender and why they may not have responded. And I just want to bring our attention to the to how as the Black community, how do we respond to our incarcerated individuals, and how many of us, or how long has the community looked at incarcerated people as people who belong where they belong, don't deserve sympathy, they're getting their punishment? I don't think we've had a very open and receptive attitude toward people accused of crimes. And so, you know, the Chicago Defender may have reflected the Black community's attitude at that time. And if you really look at what happens, what kind of kids were in that place, you know, many didn't have families, many were, you know, neglected. So it wasn't really, you know, I'm sure there were some hardcore crimes that, you know, were committed by people, but, you know, look at Elwood. I looked at him and I thought, who was his lawyer? I mean, I'm a public defender, and I'm thinking, how did he ever get into that jail? Like, who was defending him? And even when we look at the, you know, the Central Park Five, how many of the Black community came out for those boys during the time that they were being accused? Far and few. So I think we have to look at ourselves when we think about, you know, why didn't the Chicago Defender said nothing? You know, I think it's just now in recent history that we're looking at, you know, how incarceration is an extension of slavery, and that we're looking at people who are being incarcerated. Maybe they aren't the people that, quote, we thought they were. So I think part of what the Chicago Defender was doing was reflecting the attitudes of the community as a whole.
Thank you, Makita.
So Makita, yes, that was a consideration. I think we've covered it, but I just want to read.
Roberta, before you say something, Charlene wanted to respond.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Unmute yourself.
You're still muted.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I think that as we live our day-to-day, we are so focused on right here, right now. And the past, which cannot be undone, the future being so unpredictable and just so chaotic, you just live in the moment. It's not that you mean to ignore or detach yourself from the strife of our people. It's, you know, you got to say thank you to those special people that take themselves away from their personal involvement. I take myself away from my family to march. I take myself away from my job to support. You know, I put myself in harm's way to make the point that all of us just don't either have time, can't take time. You know, they say if it's important, you make time. But what's important is me paying my rent, me taking care of my kids, me living day to day. And how am I helping marching in this protest, or what can I do for the Central Park Five? Like, I mean, as a child, I heard about them, and I immediately know. I said, well, where is their mother? Where is their father? How is anybody questioning these kids with their parents not around? You know, you figure if you don't feed me, you don't let me go to the bathroom, I'll tell you anything you want to know, just so long as you can let me go home, which is probably what they told them. So, and that's what I think happens to, even in the story, you're living for the moment. You're not thinking about these things until you're forced to think about them. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the last segment. We will have a wrap-up time to talk about some other things in general. So we have now we're going to circle back to talk about women and the treatment of women in this novel. And there's another very brief video clip that speaks specifically to the treatment of women in the Nickel Boys. Roberta, if you would show that quickly.
Yes, I'm getting ready to put that on. Okay, I'm going to share the screen now. But I'm first going to mute everybody, and I do that just so that you can hear it better. So I have to mute you all. All right. Yes. Share the screen.
That's a big thing for me. But setting that aside, the portrayal of women in this book was not good. I thought the women were oftentimes very one-dimensional and very archetypal. They were backdrops for men to learn things about themselves or to represent certain ideologies. And it was not subtle. And I think we see this a lot in fiction where women get short shrift, but men are these hugely developed, fully realized characters that get to have dreams and get to be introverted or extroverted and get to have their hopes dashed. And the women are just sort of, they put up with the men at all times, and they suffer and suffer and suffer. And we see that at play here in terms of Harriet, and later in terms of Denise, and then in terms of Millie.
Right, but it's agency too, right? There's nothing.
Thank you. So, you know, our group is primarily women, and we're not the shy and retiring type. We're all very we have our own views about these things. So I guess one of the questions that I has to do with what you think about how the women are presented in this novel, particularly the three major characters, Harriet, Denise, and Millie, and how you think they are presented. And if you have a favorite of those three female characters, which one is it and why? Is everybody muted?
You can unmute yourselves.
Could you remind us of who each of those characters are?
I'm sorry, Afia?
Could you remind us of who each of those is? Like, who is Harriet? I know
Harriet is Elwood's grandmother who raises him. His mother abandons him. Both parents actually, but very significantly his mother, Evelyn. His grandmother, his maternal grandmother is Harriet, who raises him. Okay. Denise is a girlfriend whom Elwood, née Turner, takes up with in the 70s. And Millie is the woman he ultimately marries as Elwood, or Elwood ultimately marries. So these are the most fleshed out. There are other women. There are white women who were treated in this novel. There are secondary women of color as well. But these are the three main female characters that this book deals with. So the question is, how do you feel about that? Do you agree with what was being discussed in that discussion about the women not being given short shrift, that they weren't fully developed characters in this novel? Do you agree with that? And if you have a specific character that you think was fairly well developed, or a favorite of those three women, which woman was it, and why do you feel that way?
It's Levon. So I disagree with those women. Harriet fills this book. Her courage is totally like not to be questioned. I'm looking at page 33, and Harriet Johnson, she was a slight hummingbird of a woman, but she did everything seriously that she thought was worth doing. She kept a sugarcane machete under her pillow for intruders. And she marched in civil rights. She risked her life and her livelihood to get into that 57 Cadillac to go downtown to sit-ins. And she raised Elwood. She believed in Elwood, and she nurtured that spirit of courage. He was loved. So I'll stop there. I disagree. Also, I'm a little suspicious because I'm hoping we remember that Colson Whitehead's main character in the Underground Railroad was totally, I think, unexpected for us. Do you know, I think most people would have been expected that it would be a man who would be, the fugitive runaway. But in fact, he does something I think that is, maybe it's not PC to say this, but quite revolutionary in helping us to reimagine that the body of a leader taking on so much risk to life and limb and psyche. That's the other thing. I think Harriet was a good steward of Elwood's psyche.
Thank you, Levon. Anyone else? So, yes, Afia.
Okay, I did raise my hand in the chat too, but I agree with the sister who just spoke. I felt that Harriet, the grandmother, was well developed. I felt that she was what kept Elwood going. The way that she trained him, the way that he thought, I felt that she framed most of that for him. And she did engage a lawyer for him. She did the very best that she could by him. So I thought she was well developed, and her heart was throughout that book. Even when she was not speaking, I could feel her in that book, and how, because he kept thinking about her and speaking about her. Elwood mentioned her a lot. So clearly she had a strong influence on his life, and she was what kept him hoping and expecting that something good was going to come out of this.
Yeah, she's certainly optimistic. She's strong. There was just Lana just put something in the chat about the bookends, Harriet being one of them. Our assumption is Millie is the other end. Millie is the other bookend, the one whom he ultimately marries and is in a 19-year relationship with before she finds out who he really is. So that's a very interesting and very telling piece. And what about Denise? What about Denise rocking her fro in the 70s? And there's a very interesting description of Denise here as well. Anyone want to tackle Denise? If you look on page 137, there's an excerpt about Denise. It says, Denise was tall and Harlem tough and could have played basketball in one of the lady leagues. One of these city girls who wasn't afraid of anything. He'd seen her curse out this muscle-bound turkey who whispered something untoward as she passed on the street. She got up in that dude's face, but a rat made her squeal like a little girl. Denise was was most definitely not a little girl. So when she let out that part of her, it was always a surprise. She lived on 126 next to a vacant lot, and the heat and now the garbage made the empty lot livelier than usual. The bastards were everywhere, bursting out of their underground hidey holes. She said she saw a rat as big as a dog last night bark like one too. He opined that maybe it was a dog, but she wasn't going back today, and he was glad to have her. What about Denise?
It's not so much about Denise, Alexa, but there was another woman who we learned about who was in an abusive relationship. Somebody's mother was a Turner's mother.
His aunt.
His aunt, right? And so the first way that he explains it, he says she liked her son just fine, but she liked liquor more, right? And I was like, oh, please God, like go, she deserves more than just that sentence. And he did go on to qualify it. And I do think that these women in the book are written about, right? Like he uses a number of words to talk about them, but it's all of their existence centers around their proximity to the male identity and the male figures in the story. And granted, it's a story, it's Elwood's story. It's also coming through the lens of like Colson. And so one thing that's interesting that Debbie just mentioned is that his editor earlier was a female identifying individual of the other book. And so it should be, I guess, a little heavy-handed. There's no denying that Harriet and Denise, these women, impacted the men who they held proximity to. From my opinion, the way in which they were written about in this book was to further the agenda of the telling of a man's story. And just because there's not, like, it's really hard to write a narrative where every character we get to see ping-ponged in dramatic events to the same extent, right? Because there's only so many pages and we want to say all the things about the system. And so these women were touched to the men, but similar, it's like, what's the movie we were watching? We were watching The Santa Claus the other day, and the wife comes on with Tim Allen, I think that's his name. Anyway, she just has these one little liners, and you know that she like really loved the son, and you know that she was a good wife, but like her only purpose in the story is to move it along. And we know what she does for a living, and we know like how she maybe likes her coffee, and we know what she's probably going to order at a diner, but that doesn't mean that she's as fully flushed as she possibly could be.
Anyone else? Other opinions? So that kind of brings us to Millie. Millie is the finalist in this, and in many ways, as to Lana's point, sort of the other bookend to Harriet. One of the questions we may ask ourselves when we read this book is whether, and we know that Harriet invested a lot in Elwood, both emotionally and certainly in his defense, financially. She gave the money to the lawyer who absconds with their money, and her hopes, takes her hopes with them. And she dies a year after Elwood's death. We learn that she passes away also. And so she actually loses a lot. She seems to be someone who's constantly lost. But do you think that her upbringing of Elwood, either directly or indirectly, resulted in his undoing or his final outcome? Do you feel that in the way that she raised Elwood, it unfortunately led to that or not? Was it a contributor directly or indirectly to how he ultimately ended? No opinions about that one?
Well, I do. I just want to say that, do we think, I still compare this to Whitehead's split, the fact that we're in a split character. In terms, there were times when Harriet, as we presented, was very as one would say, progressive, but there were times when she also knew, as Colson said, hey, you're going to get slapped down. And even Elwood knew that his grandmother was progressive to a point, but pulled back. So the only thing that I wish that she had been able to do is, did she give Elwood enough street smarts? Remember, she isolated him. She picked who his friends were that were good. So is that maybe the reason why he didn't have the adequate street smarts to kind of navigate and to know when to step out and when not to step out? I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, I mean, I love that we're looking so closely at this dichotomy, but what keeps running through my mind is when I was growing up in my all-Black working class and strivers neighborhood in Queens, we were actually taught to be like Elwood, to look out for each other. When you saw something happening, you know, in the neighborhood, you were to step up. And if you were too tiny, you know, too much of a child to do it, you were to go home and report it to the grown-ups, and then they would do it. So, you know, it's so heartbreaking, again, that we are questioning Elwood in this way. We're interrogating him for his behavior, which is something I know that when I was a child growing up in that Strivers neighborhood in Queens, everybody spoke of this as how we were to be with each other. And, you know, when Elwood steps in to what's happening in the bathroom, for example, or when Elwood writes his letters, when Elwood documents everything. These are all things I know that as a child growing up, I was taught to do. And certainly as a child of the 60s, the community was to be Elwood-like. So I just think, you know, our interrogating Elwood, you know, it breaks my heart that we're doing that.
I don't think of it as an interrogation of Elwood or even as an interrogation of Harriet. Think of it's more of an exploration and of a reality as we look at as that. I think we all wanted Elwood to win. Everybody wanted Elwood to escape. I know that there may be a fraction of people who saw it coming, that he wasn't going to get out. But I think the majority of us were rooting for Elwood to make it. We wanted him to be that gingerbread man that outran it all and managed to become great. But as we saw and I think that one of the reasons that Whitehead keeps drawing that parallel with Dr. King is that Dr. King's altruism, his high moral character and all of that wound up, unfortunately, being his undoing as well. And so that's one of the parallels that the book draws. And when you hear other interviews of Whitehead, he talks a bit about the optimism part of it in this reality of the world that we're living in today's reality and what we see going on right now around us in this political environment and quagmire. But just to wrap up, I just want to go back to Millie and talk a bit about her, and then because we are going to be hearing.
Peter raised her hand. Do you want to let Peter
close? So could we talk a bit about Millie? Could somebody want to discuss her for a bit? Marquita?
I don't want to talk about Millie. I just want to talk about, this is just a point. I just think we're blaming the victims here. You know, the problem isn't that Dr. King was too kind or that Elwood was too kind and he wanted to help his community. And we're talking about doing that every day trying to help each other and trying to be responsible. You know, this problem is racism.
Absolutely.
And it's not their character that caused their deaths. It's racism. And I don't think we should, blame the mother for trying to raise, or grandmother for trying to raise an honorable, caring man. The problem is racism. And, it's just, I think we're blaming the victims. That's all I wanted to say.
I said at the beginning that the antagonist in this was systemic racism. We're talking about the overarching antagonist in the novel is systemic racism. It threads its way through all of it. It threads its way through all of the things that we've talked about, the prison industrial complex, whether it's optimism versus pessimism, whether it's the treatment of women or how the women were perceived, or racism threads through this whole thing. So no, I don't want it, and I apologize if it appears that we are in a blame game, because that's not what we're doing. I think the hope is that we're exploring these characters as what they are, as humans with foibles like we have, with decisions that are good and bad, that are right and wrong, just like the ones that we make every day. And so I think that it adds to the richness of the dialogue to be able to ask ourselves these questions and to express differing opinions about how we see these characters develop. That we're not comparing the writing of Whitehead's Cora in the Underground Railroad to the women in this, because this is a totally different standalone novel. And the female characters in this novel are the ones in this novel, in the Nickel Boys. There are some that we may feel an affinity for. Those that we might have liked to have known a bit more about. I certainly would have liked to have known a bit more about Evelyn, Elwood's mom, that would have led her, the darkness within her, or the difficulty that she had in being maternal to him, that left him with his grandmother to begin with. So those are some of the explorations, but we can have a general discussion now before we wrap up within the next 15 minutes. And then we'll have Lady Lana close us out and send us forth into the holidays and the next gathering.
Before you go, Althea has her hand up really quickly.
Well, I think it might be speaking. I think it might be speaking to what Alexa just said. I find it interesting that we find it necessary to kind of defend, and we feel that that we take this book so personally, and it's to the author's credit that we take it so personally that we are. Oh boy, I don't have the vocabulary. Feeling the need to defend the characters. I don't recall us doing that ever before in our group. Taking the characters so personally that we feel the need to defend them, and that we relate to them so deeply that we see ourselves in them, and therefore find it necessary to defend them and don't like the dissection of them. What is it we don't want to look at? And I say we, not you, I say we.
Yeah.
We, us. So I think that's very much to Colson's credit that he is able to write characters so well that we identify with them so much personally. That's
yeah.
all
I think what one of the things we're seeing here is that in that world of systemic racism that you were talking about, I don't want to say your name because I have that in my room, that same name device in my room, so I don't want to say Donovan's first name.
Okay.
But yeah, because what I wanted to say is that systemic racism makes it very difficult for us as Black people to live with integrity. So I'm thinking about Harriet having gone to visit Elwood one Sunday, and they told her some nonsense about why she couldn't see him. But she wanted to do the right thing as the elder family member, see about my child, see what's going on. They gave her hogwash, and she did come back eventually. But I think, Afia, what this says to us is when we see the systemic racism made small enough in that facility, we know about that place. And even though it's a physical place, in this book, we know about it. And we know how difficult it is, if you're Elwood, to live with integrity in that place. So I think we all are mourning the challenges we all have about that is yet, if it's innocence as children, it's integrity as adults. Both are off stage for us. We don't get to have them, and it pisses us off.
Thank
Oh,
you.
I think that's beautiful because that's helping me. Thank you. Really appreciate Millie more, because naming and thinking and knowing someone is so much intertwined with their name and who they have told you they are and who you have been calling them and believing them to be. And in fact, once Millie learns after 19 years, oh, within a split second, we see that affirmation, her affirmation of his truth, of who he is. And you know, Elwood is living on. King is living on through us. So it's not like, you know, anyway, I'll stop there. But yeah.
Thank you, Levon. Ms. Turner?
Yeah, I think that both Liv's statement and then Levon's follow-up to that was pretty much where I was headed in what I was going to say a little bit earlier. I think that these women, as I think I mentioned to Alexa yesterday or the day before, I don't know that I needed to know more about them because I knew who they were. And I used that one sentence to say that I thought of them as bookends. They are the ones who have upheld, as Harriet, what it means to be a human being in spite of and in despite the racism that she had to encounter. She brings him to the hotel where he reads and he does what he needs to do, while third generation, he doesn't want to be the fourth generation working in that hotel. She raises him from the standpoint of he is going to be the success. He is the one that is going to follow through, and he does. He is that person. There is heartbreak, of course, but he maintains, as a young man, he's looking forward to going to college. No one said that to her before. You know, they're holding money together, doing everything they possibly can. By the end of the book, we see after 19 years that he's able to say something to his wife. She doesn't even know his first name. Finally, she tries it out. But she too is going to uphold what's coming next, what the future holds. She is that Black woman. She is us. We are her. We are also Harriet. We know Harriet. We are both of those women. We are both the ones who have held on to the past and tried to figure out how to launch these kids going forward. And we are the ones who at the end can still mop that brow and say, you go on, Jack.
Thank you. Well, we're coming up on 6 o'clock. It's been another interesting discussion. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you for coming. It's been a while since we've been able to gather, and it's great to see you all. It's so wonderful to be in dialogue with you again.